Hello, everyone, and good morning. Welcome to the first climate conversation of this year's festival, where we are taking a temperature check of the state of our energy and climate debate. My name is Amy Harder. I'm executive editor of Cypher News. We're a new publication covering energy and climate technologies. I'll be moderating a few conversations throughout this week, and I'm thrilled to be here. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Julio Friedmann, whose day job is chief scientist at Carbon Direct, a carbon management firm, and previous stints have included the U.S. Energy Department and the Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. You may have seen his other title in the agenda, Carbon Wrangler, hence his Western-themed top. He has spent most of his career somehow working to take the carbon dioxide that we emit into the sky and putting it somewhere where it won't heat up the planet, wrangling carbon to the ground, you could say. He knows a hell of a lot about reducing carbon emissions and removing it from the sky, but he also knows pretty much everything else about our climate debate, which is why he is here to set the stage for us. Julio and I will have a chat, and then we'll throw it out to you in the audience for questions. So please be thinking of things you'd like to ask him. And if we run out of time, Julio has promised to stay after and chat up anybody who would like. So we will dive in, but before we do that, a level-setting question for those of us in the audience. Raise your hand if you work directly on energy and climate technologies. Okay, great. So I think that's a relative minority, so we're excited to set the stage for those who may not be in it as well. Julio does a great job of that. Unlike, say, a global pandemic or artificial intelligence, where changes seem to happen almost literally overnight, the changes in our energy and climate space and our move toward cleaner energy seems to happen at a glacially slow pace. So Julio, can you give us a metaphor for where are we at in this debate and in our journey toward cleaner energy?
Thank you, Amy, and of course, thanks to the Idea Festival. I'm delighted to be here. We're going to actually need a metaphor different from glacial pace because we're losing glaciers, and pretty soon we won't be able to talk about that anymore. You can choose your own metaphor, choose your own adventure kind of thing. A lot of people like, what grade would you give the United States? I would say we're giving like a C-, but it's very early in the semester. There's still a possibility to get an A grade. I think it's actually more useful to think about it like we're in step 2 of a 12-step program. The first step is acknowledge we have a problem, which is good. But the next 10 steps are not a given. They're also not obvious necessarily. And there is a lot of room for reasonable people to disagree about what exact steps we should take and how much investment and what order and so forth. Among other things, I look forward to hearing your discussions later this week with groups to discuss those exact things. But the core science is pretty well understood. The set of solutions is pretty well understood. So now we're basically starting to haggle over price, which is in fact the right discussion to have.
The price of new energy technologies, the price of old technologies, or both?
There's 3 sources of money in the world: ratepayers, taxpayers, and shareholders. And everybody wants somebody else to pay for it, but that's where the money comes from. And we've learned already that there's nothing about the energy transition that is inevitable or free. There are some circumstances where some kinds of energy, like wind or solar, in fact, are cheaper than other alternatives. That's great. We should be deploying those bigger and faster than we are in developed countries and in the developing world. That is not the totality of the discussion by any means. I spent a lot of my time thinking about heavy industry, like steel and cement and chemicals and all that stuff. Cars emit 6% of the emissions in the world. Cement emits 6% of the emissions in the world. If you're not thinking about cement, you're not taking this seriously. Steel emits 7%. Also, about 60% of the steel and cement in the world are made by China. And the last time I checked, the United States doesn't make policy there. So we have to think constructively about what it is we do and how we get it done.
So the Inflation Reduction Act, which I'm sure everybody in this room has been following to some degree, is really ushering in a new climate era. For decades, we were debating and fighting over whether to solve climate change, whether it really is a problem worth solving. And companies were mostly fighting it, or at least on the sidelines. I wrote a recent column where the headline was our wild and wonky new climate era, where we went from fighting it to now debating how to solve it, which is actually a lot harder than the last 30 years that what we've been doing. So Julio, has the IRA helped our grade some? Is it inching us closer to an A?
It's hugely transformational, actually. And not just the IRA. There's actually been a slate of bills, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the 2020 amendments to the Energy Policy Act, the CHIPS Act, the annual appropriations process. Actually, there's a bunch of things we're doing that are really helping quite a bit. The IRA is the biggest of all of these. Interestingly, the biggest climate bill of all time doesn't have the word climate in it. That also reflects the moment we're living in. So it goes. The other thing that gets back to your point about wild and wonky, like fundamentally, you have to be a tax lawyer to really understand it. That's how we're doing energy policy in the United States, through tax law. And so the IRS is suddenly being handed all these billets about like, well, like, does hydrogen qualify given the hourly matching or annual matching of electricity dispatch? That's not a typical IRA question. So they're trying to figure out what's the right thing to do, and they're asking people to sort of help them out. But that's literally sort of how we're doing it. Europe does not do it this way. Europe does it with edicts and regulation and taxes. We hand out lollipops. That's the United States way. We typically match that also with regulations of other kinds. So things like the power plant draft law that's come out recently, that the EPA has put out. They put out a draft regulation on existing power facilities. Excellent. That's a complement to the sort of tax law way of doing things that we do things. Similarly, things like the methane rules would fall into that category. Those would be a complement to the tax law. So all of these things are of a part, but we are now essentially equipped with all the gear we need for a very long hike. We have the technology, we have market aligning policy, and we have a lot of money. So we can start. So now actually it immediately becomes, well, what do we do? And that's a good question to have.
So speaking of hike, another audience participation moment. Raise your hand if you have already or you plan to take advantage of any of the tax credits in the IRA, whether for electric cars or heat pumps. Okay, got a few hands going up. What about if it's something you might do in the future? Okay, great, a few more. Yeah. Julio, what's your response to that? This is a crowd. I think this is relative self-selecting of people who might be a little bit more inclined, and there's still not as many hands as perhaps you might have thought.
That actually looks about right to me. One of the things I've come to believe, rightly or wrongly, is Americans want electricity and energy in general to be cheap, reliable, and invisible. Nobody wants to wake up thinking about this. They want to think about other things. And so the fact that, like, I'm not planning to take advantage of a new tax law is like, that doesn't surprise me, actually. The fact that it's actually this high in this room reflects the room, and I think reflects it well. One of the things we've seen in the IRA is actually not a handful of tax credits. There's a large range of tax credits, everything from, again, heat pumps, the extensions of solar investment tax credit, the wind production tax credit, new credits for nuclear power, new credits for carbon capture, new credits for clean hydrogen. Important tax credit. That tax credit is the first tax credit, and this is a standard-setting, precedent-setting thing where you have to do a life cycle assessment of the product. How we do that, we'll find out, but then we're going to see that in future versions. Things like sustainable aviation fuel will probably go through that same thing. Things like fertilizer will probably go through that same thing. A carbon border adjustment will go through that same thing. How do you actually calculate this stuff is tricky. We've started that journey deliberately. One other tax credit I want to point to, it's not like the vehicle tax credit, which people are generally familiar with, or the rooftop solar tax credits. There's one that almost nobody knows about. It's one of my big favorites, 48C. So again, you got to be a tax guy to like get into this. 48C is $9 billion worth of tax credits to rebuild American manufacturing for clean tech. It's a lot of money. By the way, half that money has to go to districts that produced coal in 2010. Census districts that produced coal in 2010. So there's actually an attempt to look at those communities that have been producing fossil fuels and say, how can we get a new business in there, making electrolyzers, or making solar panels, or making clean steel, or whatever it is, or making EVs. And those tax credits basically can go a long way towards getting more manufacturing, more jobs going into these communities as well. It's a hidden gem that's in there, but it reflects the breadth of the law.
And I want to get back to that about the importance of making sure that fossil fuel communities, whether in the United States and around the world, have a path toward cleaner energy as well. But before we move off the IRA, I want to ask a question about companies. So pre-IRA, you know, the driver's seat was activists, Bill McKibben, Greta Thunberg. Now it's Amazon and General Motors and others who are here at this festival this week who are going to be talking about their climate goals. Julio, though, to provide some cold water on this momentum, a recent report found that although a growing number of companies are committing to this goal of net zero emissions by 2050, very few of them, if any, have actual credible goals. What's going on?
Right. So, as a shameless self-plug, I wrote a blog a while ago called The 7 Stages of Net Zero Commitments. And companies start by going, we're going to hit net zero. And then their CEO turns to their team and goes, what are we going to do? And they go, blah, 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 like they really don't know. And they get into it, and it turns out to be properly hard.
I read the blog post. It's worth reading. I wouldn't say that if I didn't think so. So
right.
Check it out.
So again, it's like I said, we're on the second step of a 12-step program. like,
and sometimes people go back to the first step.
Sometimes people go back to the first step. I'm actually delighted that the festival here has not just General Motors and Amazon, but Chevron and a whole bunch of companies. What is interesting is that the first sort of big champions out of the gate have been all the tech companies, which have an interesting set of conditions around their operation, very low direct emissions and huge gobs of money. So that allows them to be good early actors, actually. But
like Microsoft.
Like Microsoft, for example. And Microsoft made the boldest commitment yet, in my humble opinion. They said, not only are we going to be net zero by 2030, which is soon, they said, and then we're going to remove all of our legacy emissions forever. So we will be net zero historically as well as in operations, which means a lot of CO2 removal, which is just arithmetic. Like, if they want to do that, they got to remove CO2. So, and they basically put out all their data, they put out all their information, they said, hey, the stuff that we can actually control in our own operations, in our own supply chains, we can drop about 60%. That's a good number. And then they said the other 40% we can't. So let's get into the carbon removal business. And they actually partnered with Carbon Direct. We've helped them find valid, durable CO2 removal. We also have drafted and published with them criteria for what's the good stuff, criteria for high quality CO2 removal. Specifically, so companies who want to do this can start thinking about what's good versus what's not good.
I want to move to more about fossil fuels. So despite the incredible growth of wind and solar, which has been objectively incredible, the world's overall energy consumption still remains largely fossil fuels. In fact, the percentage of energy consumption from fossil fuels is around 81%. That figure has not changed in around 50 years. Which is incredible to think about all the investments we've made, that although we talk about an energy transition, on a global level, it's still mostly an energy addition. So, Julio, how can we actually get, on a global level, to get clean energy to supplant fossil fuels?
Right. So, I'm going to break your question down to 3 pieces, if I may. First one is just level setting for the audience. You emit this much today. You were emitting this much yesterday, now you're emitting this much today. If you build clean energy from here forward, you're still emitting this much. So you got to do other stuff. There's only 3 ways to reduce emissions: conservation and efficiency, carbon management, shutting stuff off. That's the full list.
By carbon management, you mean direct air removal and things like that?
Carbon capture, CO2 removal, fuel switching. There's a basket of things that you can do where you're actually saying we're going to emit less carbon here at this asset or here at this place. Things like EVs are an effective carbon management pathway in that they are substituting, they are displacing. Actually, I take it back. That's actually shutting stuff off. That is like saying we had an internal combustion engine, we're turning that off. If, however, you have a car and you buy an electric car and you still drive the old car, not shutting it off, not reducing emissions.
Which, by the way, is what most electric car drivers, they have 2 cars, one's a gas, one's electric.
Right. So it ends up being about the tons you emit, the vehicle's mile driven, by what kind of vehicle. It gets pretty wonky pretty quickly. So back to your question, fossil energy. Last year, highest demand ever for oil, highest demand ever for natural gas, highest demand ever for coal. When people are like, carbon management is throwing a lifeline to a dying industry, I'm like, what dying industry? I don't see any dying industries here. Even in countries, say, within the European Union or within North America, there is still very high demand for fossil energy. That fossil energy demand has not shrunk as much as people think it has or would like it to have. So what do? And these are places we've done a lot of efficiency, we've built out a lot of renewables. We have to think more broadly, inclusively, aggressively. For me, the hardest part of this problem, and I was speaking with Andrew about this just a little bit earlier, is actually how do you decoalify? 25% of the emissions in the world or more are just coal emissions. And it's a huge, big problem, and there's attendant health problems and blah, blah, blah. You can lecture people all you want, we're still using more coal. So how do you decoalify? It's actually a very hard problem.
And would you say the problem is mostly currently in developing countries with coal?
No, I would not, actually. So we just got schooled on this, in part because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Europe turned on all of its coal plants all of a sudden. And Germans are like, we're virtuous, bad Poland, but can we please have your coal power? This is how a lot of this is done today. And in fact, Texas is going through a heat wave right now. People want cooling in their lives. They're turning on the gas plants, they're turning on the coal plants. Those are also less reliable. They're having complications with their operation. The ramping up and down is hard. There's the stuff that's going on as well, but you can't pretend those plants don't exist, they don't provide value, and they don't emit. All of those things are true. So how do you get that into your thinking machine? You have to be more overt about the turning off part. So you have to displace an existing plant. That plant's already making money. So how do you do that? The plant owner's making money. Can they make money buying renewables off the grid? Usually not. So what do you actually do? Can you do carbon capture? In some places, maybe yes. In some places, maybe no.
You mean point source carbon capture from a facility?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So maybe you can capture from the natural gas combined cycle power plant. Maybe you can't. Maybe there's
but that's very expensive also.
It is expensive. 45Q goes a very long way around that, but for a lot of things, it doesn't make it break even. And even if it makes break even, an investor wants a 10% IRR. So they're like, I'd love to do your project, but I can make more money investing in AI.
And 45Q is, of course, another part of the IRA tax policy.
Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you for rescuing my wonkiness. The sensibility I'm trying to give you with here is one that actually came out of this morning's conversation and the one that came out of last night's conversation. You don't make progress by demonizing these people, period. If you want a gas plant to emit less, you should work with the gas plant to make them emit less. One of the things in the new draft ruling or statute from the EPA is to say there's 3 ways you can reduce emissions at a gas plant. They're paying attention. They're good ideas. One of them, run it less. 55% capacity factor. I'm sorry, less than, I think it's 60% capacity factor. So there's whatever the capacity factor, if you run it below 60% capacity factor, you can keep running it for a while. Eventually, you'll have to still phase it out. That's one option. That means most of those gas plants are going to run at 59%. Just 1% below what's required. Second thing, you can do point source carbon capture on that plant, but you got to do a lot of it. No small measures. You got to do 90% capture or you don't qualify, which is reasonable to ask. And then the last thing is you can blend in clean hydrogen. Clean hydrogen, at this point, definition unclear, but probably the same definition as what's in the other parts of the IRA. And so you can bring in that clean hydrogen, you can blend it down. But again, it's got to be a lot out of the gate. 30% start, you want to get to 60%, and then at some point you still got to shut it off. So that's the kind of thing you got to start doing. Building more renewables doesn't do that. The regulation does that. But the bite comes out of it with these new incentives.
Where does the concept of long duration energy storage, so not lithium-ion batteries, but other technologies that can hold energy for hours or days at a time, where does that come in?
So let me start with my unvarnished biases on this, because I'm not a battery guy. There are actually battery guys in the room, including the new dean of the Dura School of Sustainability. There are lots of technology options for long duration electricity storage. Vanadium flow batteries, and so forth. Those are really good. They're getting better. They're getting cheaper. We're seeing a lot of progress there. Those are competing now with things like pumped hydro, where you can do it, which is pretty cheap and easy.
And that's the most common way we actually store energy these days.
Correct.
Globally.
Pumped hydro is literally like at night you pump the water back up a hill. Does the job. We're starting to see people think about hydrogen storage as a way to store the electricity. You lose efficiency on the round trip, there's a real problem with the efficiency of that, but you can do it. And a big hydrogen salt mine can store literally, there's one they're making in Utah right now, it will store 150 times all of the batteries in the United States. It's just a lot of energy storage in one place. And a big hydrogen salt cavern can get that for you. Is it cheap? No. Is it free? No. Is it easy? Not really, but that's a thing you do. The unvarnished bias part comes from what's the value proposition on the grid actually? Again, who gets paid by doing this? If you're a battery operator and you build a big battery and you dispatch twice a year, hard to make that capital investment work. How do you actually get paid? So people are thinking about things like vehicle to grids. Maybe all the cars that we're building, all the EVs can serve that same role. Maybe, but that requires a very different way of thinking about EVs than the way we're thinking about them now. Those things become ancillary service vendors in every home. That requires software, that requires compliance, that requires contracts. There's a whole other set of things that you need to do to make that happen too. Does that make it wrong? No. It's just like none of this ends up being easy or inevitable. You have to work every corner of it, and you have to work it diligently. Not just the technology part. People got to get paid. And they got to obey the laws. And the communities have to say yes.
Which is a big question, which I want to come back to in a moment. Julio has mentioned hydrogen a couple of times. If you want to dive deep into that, I'll be moderating another conversation on that tomorrow afternoon, where we will get into the depths of that Swiss Army knife energy source, as some folks have called it. But I want to go big picture for a moment and talk about another conversation I'll be hosting on Tuesday afternoon with two scientists. One is in the room, Steve Koonin now. We'll be talking about whether or not the energy transition is moving too fast. Some folks say we might be moving too slow. I would love to hear from you, Julio, on what you're hoping to hear from that conversation and some things that you think, if some of the folks in the audience go to that conversation, what should they keep in mind?
So a couple of things. Thank you very much. This is a great question. The thing I would hope to get out at some point out of that conversation is what are the points of agreement? There's actually a lot of agreement in the energy and climate community. A lot. The differences are what makes the news, but in fact, most experts agree on the fact that we got a problem, what this basket of solutions is, how much they cost. Like there's not that much disagreement within that pool. So I would want to see something about that. I would want to see, in addition to that, a place where people are talking about literally like this question of pace. So if you believe that climate change is real, science is pretty clear on that, then the question becomes—
that it is, and that human activity is having a big impact.
Exactly. Then the question becomes, what do you actually do? And that, at that point, the wheels come off. Like there's a lot of range around what do you do. And so what we have learned in the past couple of years is that having greater volume around urgency is not sufficient. You still got to do stuff. You need to build things.
We don't just need net zero goals. We actually need—
You need to build things.
Yeah.
And so the question that I would want to see them discuss in part is like, well, okay, what are the actual steps necessary to build things, including the money, including the workforce, including the permitting? I'd want to hear them talk a bit about permitting reform, because that's the crux of the biscuit right now for real. Everybody, and I do mean everybody on the Hill, when you say, do we need permitting reform, they go, hell yes, and then immediately they differ in their opinions. Like, there's no consensus on what that means. But the current pathway is broken and it ain't deliver in the future. So how do we solve that becomes very real. And I would love to hear some thoughts from your panelists about that.
Let's dive just an inch into the permitting conversation. Another audience participation moment. Raise your hand if you've ever— and if you feel comfortable sharing with the crowd, this is a safe space. Raise your hand if you've ever thought about or have participated in some sort of protest for something being built next to you. I'm going to raise my hand. I've thought about it. I'm guessing it's higher than that, so we'll let folks think about that in their own heads. Ezra Klein of the New York Times had an interesting interview with the California governor, Newsom, the other day, all about this topic, and he just expressed extreme disappointment and admonishment of environmental groups like the Sierra Club for fighting the need to build new projects. And that goes back to this wild and wonky world we're living in. We were spending 30 years deciding what to do, and now we need to build all of that. So, Julio, how can we get community consensus, not bulldozing over communities who have legitimate concerns, but instead finding a way to speed up the process in a way that's satisfactory to most parties? Will never satisfy everybody.
Right. So I recommend people take a look at that piece, by the way. It's fantastic. Sammy Roth did a very similar piece, actually, in the LA Times.
And Sammy does an incredible job in this whole—
in this space.
NIMBYism, for lack of a better term.
Right. And again, the people have already said, we need to change the rhetoric to YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. I'm like, good luck with that. Like, and people are like, oh, my housing value will drop. Like, they change their thinking pretty fast. But we need to build, like environmental groups for real are fighting solar build out. They're fighting transmission build out. They're fighting wind build out. Like,
and there's always a legitimate reason why.
Yes,
there's some endangered species.
Exactly.
But
there are, in fact, often very legitimate reasons. And often it comes at the cost, again, to disadvantaged communities, which have had to share the brunt of these challenges to date. And they're like, you're asking more of these people, why are you doing this? So I wrote, actually, with Gernot Wagner, a piece in the Washington Post answering your question. What are the things to do? There's basically, again, 3 things that we recommended. Thing 1, nationalize everything. We think this is a bad idea. We think this will not happen. But it is an option.
That's what they said yesterday in the opening session.
Right.
Suggest bad ideas.
Right. And you know, for years I heard people say we need to put climate on a wartime footing. That's what wartime footing means. Which is why we're still cleaning up like uranium wastes in the Navajo land. So we're like, sorry, Navajo, we got to make a bunch of uranium right now. So when you nationalize things, you get wartime footing, but you get all the consequences with that. Not a great way to do it. Also, like, that will launch 1,000 legal challenges. Second way to do that is you basically expand existing authorities that agencies have. So for example, FERC, which regulates electricity transmission in the United States. There's some wiggle room around their authorities around transmission lines. You could expand that. And then they're like, well, we're going to now authorize this stuff. And people will be upset, but it is done within existing frameworks and rule of law. It is done within the existing system. Similarly, FERC, if it wanted to, could say, we're going to create CO2 management utilities. Because we create utilities, and we're going to let power pools figure out how they want to do that, and they can aggregate the costs and pass them on to ratepayers. Like, that's another way to do this. You can get the Department of Transportation to just start saying, we're going to declare rights-of-ways for the projects that we need, because they regulate those things. So you can imagine a supersizing of government agencies, which is not nationalization, but is very much a big brother kind of coming into your backyard way of doing it. The third way, which is the way that I think is going to be most productive, and the way we think is hopeful, is in fact turbocharge community engagement. Right now, communities are really not being talked with, so as a consequence, we don't really know what they want. There are a lot of people who claim to speak for communities, but the communities aren't really speaking for themselves. In order to do so, they need resource. They need some money, they need some lawyers, they need some technical experts. The government's got those things. Governments, state governments, federal governments could do a lot, actually, by helping communities and arming them with the personnel to figure out how to get to yes. My experience has been that some communities are just like, hell no, Cancer Alley, no. That's a reasonable perspective. Other communities are like, you know, we don't care about this other thing. What we really need is we need a school or a hospital. Could you help us with that? Other communities are like, hey, we love your hydrogen project. We care about asthma in our community. Is there something the hydrogen project can do to lower pollutants that will give us less asthma? But until you have those conversations, you don't know what to do. And so there is a way to think about engaging the Department of Justice, the national labs, a whole bunch of other people to say, can you reach out and start engaging with communities in a positive and constructive way? We are doing a project in a community. That project will probably get built in about 4 or 5 years. We went there 3 months ago. The community was like, you're talking to us? Before the project's baked? You want our input? They were delighted. And when I say community engagement, I mean like church groups, I mean civic boosters, I mean the mayor and the Chamber of Commerce, like the whole community, trying to understand what they care about. And
these are often rural communities that may have an inclination to not support clean energy
rural
or be
communities, disadvantaged
cautious.
communities, communities of color, they actually want agency, they actually want a voice. So trying to empower that is actually a way to start overcoming these challenges. I'm not sort of naive enough to believe that's sufficient. But if the idea is we need 1,000 projects, maybe we can get 300 of them this way, that's a good start. Maybe that's step 4 of a 12-step process.
One of the most interesting conversations I'm looking forward to watching this week, which you mentioned a moment ago, Julio, is an interview with Mike Wirth, CEO of Chevron. What do you think is the role for oil companies in our climate debate, considering their product is the primary cause of climate change, and many have fought and stalled efforts on climate change over decades?
I want to quibble a bit with your point. I think I can still answer it positively and well. the problem is not the product they make, the problem is our use of the product they make. Like, I have a caricature in my mind where, like, my neighbor is ExxonMobil, and I walk over to them every day and go, "You're ugly and I hate you. Here's a bunch of money." And they're like, "Here's your oil." And they're like, "I still hate you." And then I walk away. Like, this is what we're doing. Like, it's not great, you know? But in point of fact, in the developing world, like, this is not like an esoteric question. Nigeria is going to be the third most populous nation in the world by a lot. It's going to have 420 million people in it by 2040. It's not that far away. Their estate is oil. People are like, they can develop solar. It's like, yeah, they got good solar resources, sure, but they have like a huge oil province, and they're going to develop it. And they're going to make fertilizer, and they're going to make power. Like, they might make steel. Like, how do we do that in a way that supports them as well as enables a transition to a zero-emission future? And that's legitimately hard. Oil and gas companies have a really good role in this. Let's start with a couple of things that they have. They have money. That's good. They have incredibly talented teams of people. They know how to pull off a $2 billion project. Not a lot of places in the world know how to do that. They're fuel companies. We need zero-carbon fuels. We need zero-carbon
fuels, specifically.
Liquid fuels. But fuels like ammonia or methanol or synthetic gasoline or sustainable aviation fuel, like, that's going to end up being a big part of the budget. They can figure out how to do that. And last but not least, my favorite bit, they're full of geoscientists. So they actually know how to return carbon to the Earth. And in fact, they've been doing a lot of carbon return to the Earth in this country since 1972.
To extract more oil, mostly.
Mostly to extract more oil, yes. It is noteworthy, though, that with the passage of the IRA, that economic has flipped. So in 2018, they amended the tax law and said, you can get paid a lot more to manage the carbon dioxide. If you penciled it out, you still got more money doing enhanced oil recovery than you did just storing CO2. In the most recent amendments, that's the opposite. Now you get more revenue just storing CO2. Unsurprisingly, about 85% of the new projects announced in the United States are all saline storage projects. They're not EOR projects. Astonishing. You shift the reward structure and you get a different outcome. It's almost like, you know, law or something. I don't know, but it's...
I want to go to questions in the audience in just a few minutes. I think we have some mic runners if needed, but I think this room is somewhat small enough that we can also do without mics. So be thinking of your questions. Before we get to your questions, I want to go very, very big and kind of level set with this entire festival. You know, we're diving into so many topics ranging from AI and more. I want to ask you about technology and how it evolves from the past to the future. So many of us might know the reference to cars, that if people were given a choice, they would have chosen a faster horse and buggy instead of an internal combustion engine car. How can we break that mindset where we only envision the future based upon what we know in the past and the present?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you. Part of the way you do it is you supercharge young people with ideas. And in fact,
hence the Aspen Ideas Festival.
Hence the Aspen Ideas Festival. And actually, the head of the NYU Energy Research Center and the Door School are here. Like, that's actually literally part of the mission. And in fact, around the world, one of the things I love about Kenya is full of young entrepreneurs. Like, they're ready to go, and they're developing CO2 removal technology. They're developing new electric fertilizer technology. They're doing cool stuff. Like, so part of the thing you need to do is resource these imaginations in a productive way. The second thing you need to do is, again, be willing to be wrong about a lot of stuff. Let's be humble. I wrote a piece a few years ago about humility in CO2 removal, because in order to do CO2 removal well, I need to do a bunch of things that are way outside my experience base. I need to work with markets, and I need to work with economists, and I need to engage communities, and I need to actually build stuff. Like, I've never done any of that. So I have to be humble about what I can actually do as a technology guy. I have a friend who is now working in the Biden administration, and she says, we are only limited by the second law of thermodynamics. That's it. And that's kind of glib, but also kind of true. For carbon capture, which I care about, we are still leaving 85% of the exergy on the table. We're doing a very bad job of separating those gases efficiently. In terms of the return trip efficiency in batteries, that's already pretty good. We're getting better. In terms of driving down the cost, we have a huge frontier of stuff to do. We just had nuclear fusion in California. Are we treating that like a moment where we could really have a different future? Almost immediately, I was impressed by how many people were like, well, we can't use it before 2050, so who cares? I'm like, does time end in 2050? I don't think so. Don't we want a future like Wakanda, like where we have like abundant clean energy all over the place and, you know, thriving communities? Like, so part of it is also, and this is the last thing I'll say on the technology piece, most people are just unfamiliar with how much we've already done and how much is in progress. And the answers to that is like totally astonishing to me. So we've invested in a handful of companies at Carbon Direct that turn carbon dioxide into products, okay? And one of those companies is a company that came out of Stanford a few years ago called 12. And basically, if you know what a fuel cell is, you put fuel in the top and what comes out is electricity and CO2. They've basically built a reverse fuel cell. You put CO2 and electricity in and you get out of fuel. That's kind of cool, okay? So they were basically tinkering in the lab for a lot of years. Now they're a proper company. Measures of a proper company, they are the sole plastics provider for Mercedes-Benz. Mercedes-Benz is getting all their plastic from CO2 that was been pulled from the sky and turned into products. Also, they just sold 15 million gallons of jet fuel to the Air Force. So that sounds pretty cool, right? Do people even know you can do that? Hey, we can pull CO2 out of the air and turn it into a fuel. Is that expensive? Yes. Is it hard? Hell yes. Are people going to fight it? Yes. Is that always the right solution? No. But the technology, like, it exists. You can do something that we couldn't do before. We can take CO2 and turn it into concrete. That's new, and the concrete performs better than old concrete. We move 30 billion tons of concrete every year. Well, maybe we can put a couple of billion tons of CO2 into that. That'd be nice, you know. We have half the nitrogen atoms in your body come from fertilizer we made with the Haber-Bosch process, okay? 80% of the food in the world is through modern agriculture using the Haber-Bosch process to make fertilizer. Awesome. Is there another way we can do that? Yeah. Nobody's asked. Nobody's said, we already have fertilizer in food. So nobody said, well, how do we do it zero carbon? We're just starting that voyage. Maybe there's purely electric processes. Maybe we can hack the genome of bugs in the soils to make it for us. There is an endless domain of cool stuff to do. And I think we are limiting our imaginations about a positive future when we don't include what is possible from a technology lens.
Are you saying that, what I'm hearing from you say is that even though something is extremely hard, doesn't mean we can't try? Because I think sometimes people say, oh, things are really hard, let's just keep doing it the way we've been doing it, it's working out well enough.
Right, and in the words of Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi, impressive. Everything you said in that sentence is wrong. The thing is that we're not succeeding, actually, really. We spent a lot of money, but we're not succeeding anywhere near the level at which we'd hoped or believed, so we know that we need to do more. Also, the way we've been doing it has not delivered. I am not like a deep eco-modernist technophile. Like, I do not believe for a minute that, like, we'll just invest in technology and that'll solve everything. Like, no, that's also not going to be the case. But there's no aspect of what we're doing in the modern world that is really similar to what we were doing 20 years ago, except for burning rocks. Still burning rocks. And the reason we're burning rocks is it's actually a hard incumbent to displace. So we need to open up our brains as to what's possible in a whole new way. In that exact context, like, our journey with solar is not done. Right now, the market is full of multi-cell PV silica. That's great. Awesome. How about the multi-exciton technologies? How about perovskites? How about supermolecules? There's all these cool things that could potentially triple the amount of energy we get out of those processes, that could potentially cut the costs by 70%. Are we pursuing that with the same level of aggression that we're pursuing drugs? No. Are we pursuing that with the same level of energy with which we are funding Ukraine? No. And we have to recognize that it's all hard. To get from here to the new world that we want, it's going to take miracles on every front. The transmission build-out is a miracle. The critical supply of minerals is a miracle. The amount of money we have to spend is gobsmacking. You know, like, I could just go on and on. Like, the amount of infrastructure we have to build, ports and fuels and all that stuff, like, it's all hard. And so when people are like, well, my part's easy, so that's the answer. I'm like, no, it's all hard. Even your part's hard because your part can't scale to the whole world everywhere and everything. So the arithmetic of net zero is really harsh. If there's one thing I want you to leave this with, it's this. The arithmetic of net zero is unforgiving. If you emit anything ever, anywhere, you emit anything in any sector, anywhere on Earth, you have to unemit the same amount. That's tough math. And that's also what the IPCC told us we got to do. So,
speaking of hard, let's get to some questions in the audience. Yes?
Hi, thank you. It's good to see you. Joan Michelson, Electric Ladies podcast. I'll stand up since I'm higher than you guys on this little platform. I just came from speaking at another conference called Sun Valley Forum, and one of the things that we wrestled with, and I think you're touching on, is how do we message this? How do we talk about it in large part in order to attract the people who were not in this room, whose help we need, whose funding we need, and to engage them in this quote-unquote hard challenge. They engaged in the moonshot, right? They engage in to your point, Julio, in drugs, developing drugs. So how do we get them engaged in this and see the positives that can come from it, like concrete made from CO2 that works better?
An excellent and vexing question. I don't claim to have super good answers, but I'll share what I think might be helpful. One of them is that it's not just a question of messaging, that there's this idea that all we need to do is make the perfect PowerPoint deck and then we're done. Like that's also not the case. But the complement to what you just said is actually part of it is actually engaging these people positively. One of the people I respect the most, another guy in government now, Brad Crabtree, who's the Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, a new title, he tried very hard to get Waxman-Markey through the gate and failed. And because he's from the Midwest, he dusted himself off the next morning and said, okay, we failed, what do we got to do? And they went and talked to a whole bunch of people who were fighting Waxman-Markey and said, what can we do? How can we work together? And after about 2 years, they were like, this is the thing we can agree on, enhanced oil recovery. And they were like, great, let's put together the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute initiative and we'll start working on it. That turned into a whole bunch of provisions which are now pulling CO2 out of the air and oceans in the IRA. But it began with—
Not just for oil.
Not just, absolutely not just for oil. In fact, the Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative became the Carbon Capture Initiative, which is now being run by Ned Kahane, and the Great Plains Institute. It's like, so, but the thing is, like, you start someplace. You start with conversations, well, what can we do together that seems possible and positive? And that unlocks money, that unlocks opportunity. The second thing I'd say is we've been having a kind of glib conversation about jobs. You know, everybody's like, the green economy will create all these jobs, jobs. And then people look at the jobs and they're like, one, that they didn't come. So there's a trust gap around jobs. And second of all, the job that was created was not as good as my old job. And the people who are fighting this the most are actually the unions. One of the things they commonly remind me of is that 99% of solar installation jobs are not union jobs. So they got a problem, right? So, but when you look at things that are in the IRA, they actually involve a lot of manufacturing. They actually look at decarbonizing fossil fuels aggressively. They look at creating clean fuels from electrons. Those look a lot more like the sort of things that people might accept. If you can, it's not just a question about messaging. It is correct to say disadvantaged communities are suffering healthcare problems because of the fossil fuels. That's correct. Getting them in a position where they want to say yes, getting the state and local governments to support a positive action, and then getting the company to want to do it, that's a lot of hand-holding, but that's the work. Everybody thinks that everyone's got a Frank Capra movie running in the back of their head, where they believe that in Act 3, Scene 4, they will stand up in front of Congress, they'll give some dizzying lecture, and the speaker will lift his glasses and say, the scales have fallen from my eyes, how much money do you need? That never happens. There is no single heroic person in this. It's all a team sport. So the Lakers win, not the point guard. That's what this looks like now. And so I think we have to get into this mode of always talking to lots of people, or else we're not going to get to where we need to go.
Another, this gentleman right here with the hat. And there's a mic coming.
Thank you. Dave Hodgins. Do you think there's a recognition of the need for this type of handholding in the IRA or more broadly outside of the folks in this room?
Yes, I do. For starters, the White House knows this. That's part of the reason they brought Sparky back. Second is all these federal agencies now have offices of community engagement. It's run by a friend of mine, Kate Gordon, at the Department of Energy. But they're like, and they have staffed up. They've been hiring people to do community engagement. That if you're going to have something like Justice 40, then you better have that too, because otherwise it's just another timetable and target. Like you don't get the good stuff. I think actually the challenge is that the modern world is keyed to reward conflict. And so there are people who are rewarded by having more conflict. And that both ends of the dumbbell get bigger and bigger, but still the heavy lifting gets done in the middle. And so I think there is a recognition of this. Last but not least, I think philanthropy is beginning to pivot into this space too with open eyes. That declaring virtue is not delivering virtue, and they're starting to think about how do we deliver virtue in a way that is sustaining and builds communities again.
More questions? Ooh, lots of questions. Julio will be staying after.
I will stay. Yes.
The lady in the flower shirt.
Thank you. I've got two questions. First, you're talking about all these great things we can make out of CO2. Are there any instances that we've got so far where the major public utilities that create a lot of this with coal are doing any of that? I know they used to talk about carbon sequestration. Initially, they'll just put a pipe and put it in the ground. I think we're past that. Is anybody actually doing it? And secondly, is from California. They're talking about starting a pilot to do hydrogen cell locomotives. And I'd like to know what you think about that.
Sure. So to the first thing, if you just do the arithmetic, almost all the CO2 is just going to go in a hole in the ground. That's just the math. Easily 90% of it's going to do that. And part of the reason why is because if you have a coal-fired power plant that's emitting 3 million tons of CO2, the most that you can put into concrete is like 30,000 tons. So you're just off by a factor of 100. Like you just can't do it. In order to make that into jet fuel, you need huge amounts of clean electricity, which immediately asks people, well, why aren't we using that huge amount of clean electricity to just shut off the coal plant? So these are reasonable questions. So, and the technology is quite young, right? So we're still getting early on. Things like the Air Force Advanced Purchase Commitment help get that company built. That's not the same thing as actually capturing the CO2 and actually turning it into the fuel. So these things are coming. I wouldn't be too down on it, but you got to be clear-eyed about where we're at and what we're trying to do. I do think that we are going to see a future where electrofuels are a real thing. There are certainly also people who are pulling CO2 out of the sky and ocean for fun and profit. And those companies are all thriving and growing. In the bipartisan infrastructure law, there was $3.5 billion to help those companies do that at scale. That's actually a pretty good investment. That's kind of the thing we should know. To get the cost of solar from where it was down to where it is today, it cost about $360 billion worldwide. It was not a cheap date, but the dividends are huge. We need to do that again with everything. With respect to hydrogen fuel cells, there are some applications where that makes sense, mostly long-haul trucks, some heavy equipment, like work in a port. Generally speaking, electrification is going to be better in most applications.
Gentleman in the way back for a quick question, and then we'll wrap up.
This is kind of related to a lot of what you're saying, but in every article I've ever read about carbon capture, free air carbon capture, first it says it's doable, this, and this company has achieved it. The second sentence is always, but it's really expensive. Well, the heat in Texas at 125 degrees is really expensive. A retaining wall around Manhattan is really expensive. That third sentence is never in the articles.
Correct. So a couple of things. First of all, if you have a choice of capturing CO2 before it goes into the air as opposed to after, do that. A lot cheaper, generally. But even there's a great analysis that was done by Jim Stock, a professor at Harvard. He ran the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama for a number of years. So not a chump, okay? And he basically looked at all of the things that were in the ARRA and said, how did those things pan out on a dollar per ton carbon basis? And things like wind were actually pretty cheap, but the incentives that were given for solar were between $80 and $300 a ton. Batteries were between $600 and $2,000 a ton. in terms of the incentives. Just my favorite, cash for clunkers was $300 to $400 a ton, okay? Now, cash for clunkers was not just about climate. We were trying to get Detroit going again. We were trying to reduce pollutant loads. There was a lot of reasons to do that. But if you just look at the dollar per ton of carbon abatement, they didn't get a lot of value out of a lot of the incentives they put together. And carbon capture from the air is going to almost surely be cheaper than decarbonizing aviation. It may be cheaper than decarbonizing a lot of steel mills around the world. It's probably cheaper than the last 5% of electricity. The first 90% we think we got a hand on. 90 to 95%, reasonable people disagree. Everybody sees the last 5% is pretty expensive. And when I say pretty expensive, like thousands of dollars a ton. Thousands of dollars a ton. Putting a heat pump under the Chrysler building is not cheap. Like, that's expensive to decarbonize. When you start putting things in a levelized cost of abatement context, how much are you actually getting for the dollars invested? In some places, carbon capture, even CO2 from the air, pencils out pretty well as a competitive landscape.
I want to say thank you very much, Julio, for this great conversation, and for the audience for joining.